By 1638, something very profound happened, Darrell, that every black person in this country needs to understand. Something very, very profound. What happened in 1638? The Maryland colony put out its first public edict. And what that edict said is that black folks shall never enjoy the fruits of white society. That is very key to what's been happening to you for 400 years.
And that is written and established in American code.
That's right.
Codified as law in
That's
America.
right. And so, and between that point, let's say up for about the next 20 years, for instance, the European colonies were putting pressure on this country, saying, hey, we didn't send you to America to have a good time, just enjoy yourself and sit back and relax. We sent you to relax. We sent you to America to produce some wealth, some resources for our European, continent. And most of the colonies were sending letters back saying, hey, we can't do anything in this country. We don't have the wherewithal. It would take us a lifetime to clear the forest, to move the bricks, to get rid of the snakes and rocks. And we need a labor force to do it. And at that point in time, the white society knew they had a need. So what happened, they brought together a very strong sense of community around that need and said, we got to find a way of resolving that problem. And they looked back at that public edict was put out in Maryland in 1638, which says black folks should never enjoy the fruits of white society, and they expanded it. Right. So by 1664, 1665, every colony in the United States enacted a slave law that says black folks shall now constitute a subordinated, excluded, uncompensated, non-competitive, managed workforce for the personal comfort and wealth building of white society. And that became your public policy that remained in existence up until recent times.
Why isn't that taught in public education now? Why don't we know that?
Because what happened immediately after that, all the institutions jumped in and all the nations in this country jumped in to justify slavery, enslaving the black folk. And so the religious institutions said, well, we have to base it on something. So they said, let's base it on biblical principles, saying the Bible that the blacks were offshoot of Ham, so therefore God had decreed that black folks should be enslaved. And that stayed in effect for about maybe a couple of hundred years, about 100 and some years, and all of a sudden they moved over to the biological and said, well, blacks are just basically biologically inferior.
So
that's what the bell curve is telling you about now.
And the bell curve, of course, is the controversial book assaulting black intelligence as genetically inferior.
That's right.
As the author alleges.
That's right.
Is the case.
That's an extension of that original public policy that was put into place back in the 16th century.
As an extension of that public policy, I think the key here is public policy. What you've talked about and outlined in very brief form is how public policy has been designed in this country around the suppression of a singular racial group.
That's right.
I want to deal with some definitions.
Okay.
Public policy was used to the extent that black people would be suppressed. Coming forward in time, blacks thought that the great salvation of the race could be summed up in one word: integration. Is that true?
Yes. Let me go pick up that public policy and bring you up to that. That public policy stayed in effect until, let's say, 1705, for instance. In 1705, it was codified in what we call the slave codes. And the slave code said at that time defined how in the future all whites would behave and how blacks would behave. And that's why what they call the Southern ethics, where blacks could not challenge whites or raise his hand to defend himself against a white person.
And in fact, white people were told that it was their duty, in fact, to suppress
that's right.
and severely
that's right.
handle blacks
that's
in order
right.
to enforce the status quo, or they themselves would be considered
that's
lawbreakers.
Right. In other words, they violated the code, the white code. And see, in that time, what the code said is that every white must enforce this code. Every religious institution must subscribe to it. All levels of government must be responsible to it. Okay, it must be passed on through your social customs, Darrell, and also through your laws. I put a lot of those laws in the back of the book.
Right.
Okay, and once that was codified in 1705, everybody understood the law. Then by 1710, for instance, Virginia then said now that we have a unified white community, they then broke up the black community by passing what they call Meritorious Manumission in 1710. And what that says now is to make sure that blacks never have a strong sense of community, a unified self, we will grant meritorious manumission. That's why all these southern states had meritorious manumission laws to any black who goes against his own people.
Which in effect said that blacks could be freed.
That's right.
To enjoy rights and privileges in the society for becoming traitors to their own race.
Right, as a free black. But it would never could be comparable to a white.
Right.
So when that law was passed, then we found that a black could be rewarded for squealing another black, what we call crabbing. And out of a possible 150 so-called insurrections or revolts, slave revolts, a black person squealed in every one of them. Okay, and he was rewarded for squealing on blacks. That's where you get the crabbing in the black society.
Which is why there was virtually never a successful black
That's
revolt.
Right. But see, and that kind of a system was never used against any other group in this country. No other group, Chinese, Hispanics, or any other group.
Well, you make a strong case in the text for the singular selection, the purposeful separating out of people of the black race for this kind of treatment on this continent.
To make sure there was never a strong sense of community, because a strong sense of community was a threat to the white society. I remember that public policy said you should be non-competitive.
And one of the ways that you say will not work
is
integration.
Okay, integration
Well,
won't.
black people think that integration is the way to go. And
Oh,
white
God.
folk have thought forever, liberal white folk have thought that integration is the way to go.
Oh, sure, if I was white too, because I really got you boxed in now. See, because that public policy, let me go back to that public policy again. At the turn of the century, that public policy was picked up by our organization, NAACP and Urban League. They saw it and they said, now we're going to come into existence and try to help black folk. What can we do? They were only permitted to help black folk in the context of the public policy. The public policy said black shall be a managed labor force. So the precepts of the Urban League and the NAACP was to help black folks find equal employment opportunity. See what I'm saying? And by the mid-1920s, Garvey and somebody said, hey, hold a second, how about some economic? And they said, no, that's out. And so we could never move blacks into starting their own businesses as a national public policy. So in the mid-19...
Because again, the law stipulated that blacks cannot have businesses compete with whites
they couldn't
or
compete.
do anything that would bring profitability to blacks and take it away from whites.
Either through, they utilize legal and extra legal means to keep blacks out. In many cases where blacks, you see, nobody in this country was more qualified, for instance, raising tobacco and raising cotton than black folk, okay, and taking care of livestock. In many instances, they would even poison the blacks' livestock. They would burn his cotton, burn his wheat. So blacks could not, and that's why if you look in the back of the book, you see all kind of laws that says blacks should not compete with blacks and compete with whites in a whole number of things. But by the mid-60s, what happened in the middle of the civil rights movement there was that, contrary to what's popularly taught, black folk didn't get free in the mid-60s. What happened at that point in time was that that technology finally caught up with that labor need for blacks. And for the first time, the public policy said, hey, we no longer need blacks to open doors and shine shoes and wash dishes and mop floors. We got technology that can do it. And when that happened, something very profound happened again to the public policy. And what they had to do then was say, the white society said, aha, now we've got to change this public policy. So what they said is that now that we no longer need blacks, what we have to do is go into a new period called benign neglect, okay, or callous indifference, or out of sight, out of mind. So then they said, so Monahan came up with a policy by the late 60s saying, or early 70s saying, it's time for us to move from focusing on black folk to focus on Indians, Hispanics, and women. But they also said what we must do in our new public policy is, first of all, make sure that all of our public policies at every level express no guilt for what has happened to black folk. Point one is pivotally important. Point two is that we show no responsibility or obligation to help blacks in any manner, okay, which means affirmative action and anything else. Point three is to make sure nothing is done to transfer that wealth that I told you, 100% wealth on one side of the sheet over to blacks, that never occurs. And that is what we've been locked into from the mid-60s up to today.